I want now to talk about the culture of imperialism. So this is sort of shifting gears rather rapidly and talk about Robert Baden-Powell, it's the best way of pronouncing it, and the origins of the Boy Scouts. And again, because I was once asked to leave the Boy Scouts in Portland, Oregon, because I was of no use and had never accumulated a single badge, this is not the origins of this lecture. And there's lots of stuff written on Baden-Powell. He's an easy person to mock. He's an easy person, I suppose, to have some sort of respect for, too, in a way, depending on your point of view. And I'm not dissing the Boy Scouts. Once I had people running up, I said, a woman came up who was a Girl Scout, and she says, oh, this is so cruel what you're saying about scouting. It's not like that. I know it's not like that now, but having had some relative who had the very strange idea of giving me, of all people, boy's life as a birthday present, and I remember, reading that and all this kind of over-the-top Americana publications. I suppose I'm reacting a little bit against that too, but there is a point to all this, and so the rest of this is about Baden-Powell and the Boy Scouts. Robert Baden-Powell was a soldier, and he believed, he came up with the idea of scouting as a way of preparing British youth for imperialism and for the next war. The origins of the Scouts, in terms of its timing, that is the first decade of the 20th century, has to be seen in terms of these international conflicts, these international great power rivalries with which we began. It comes at the time of the Moroccan Affair, the first Moroccan Affair, and the second Moroccan Affair, 1905, 1911, when it seems like the British, or the French and the Germans will go to war against each other, and they will bring in the other great powers. More about that. Robert Baden-Powell was a professional soldier, and when he went back to England, he thought that British youth were cigarette-smoking, heavy-drinking, flabby weaklings, whether they were upper classes, and even worse, in his view, lower classes, because they were underfed and therefore smaller. He hated the Oxbridge common rooms. He said, with his town life, buses, hot and cold water laid on, everything is done for you. The British working classes, like the upper classes, tended to drink a lot. He was sure that there'd be a war fought in the lifetime of these same people, and he came to the idea of scouting. Now, America has a role in all of this. I mean, we are, this country has always believed in the frontier. Those of you who had Glenn Discourse in American history and other people know about the Turner thesis about, always you can expand to the west, you can diffuse your social tensions in the east by giving people access to land, further on, and get rid of the Indians in the way, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we have friends we have friends in France who still read The Last of the Mohicans, and there's this fascination with the American frontier, and this is extremely important in the end of the 19th century in Europe, and so Baden-Powell he borrows the uniform of the Boy Scouts from the frontier uniform as he imagined it in America. The cowboy hat, the flannel shirt, their neckerchief, the short, the short pants. He said, the shape of a face gives a good guide to a man's character, the sort of firm face. He loved that. Square jaw, compared to working class loafers and shirkers, as he called them. And it's this cult of masculinity. Now, this comes at a time, one must say, when you've got very aggressive suffragism by the suffragettes who want the rights of women to vote in Britain, one of whom throws herself in front of a horse in a horse race and sacrifices her life to make a point. It comes at a time at the famous Oscar Wilde trials, and Oscar Wilde, of course, was gay. And there was a sense that the virility of English manhood was being tested by women, and Baden-Powell did not like women. He referred to women as silly women, silly girls, silly women, and by you know, and by gays, whom he saw as effeminate and therefore not really British and wouldn't be there. What good could they do in the next war? Also, it's a time where in Germany particularly, but not only in Germany, we're dueling. There's sort of that test of masculinity where if you're lucky, you'll end up with a dueling scar and not actually get killed, and most of them don't get killed. But they're dueling all over the place. You know, they're dueling in the woods outside of Paris. They're dueling almost everywhere in Germany. They're dueling still in Britain. And that sort of reaffirmation, according to Bob Nye and lots of other people, and all sorts of people have written on this, and Ute Frevert, my colleague, who's now gone, unfortunately, you know, this is part of the reaffirmation of virility. And the tendency is to say, looking back, is that, well, they're taking it out on animals, blowing the hell out of them, and indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera. So scouting for boys takes off. It spreads from Britain to Australia, to Canada, to New Zealand, to India, to Chile, to Argentina, to Brazil. In 1910, it starts in the United States. And in 1910, Baden-Powell resigns from the command of a division of the Territorial Army to spend the rest of his life involved in scouting. And again, what I'm saying is that this involves a sort of grafting on this idea of the American frontier. You're going to create your new frontier. Your new frontier is going to be in Africa. Your new frontier is going to be in Afghanistan. You create your frontiers, and then you hold the frontiers, and you train these boys, these young men, to hold the colonial frontier. And he finds sponsorship in the Daily Telegraph, which was a big conservative newspaper. All the big newspapers are conservative. And the 60,000 scouts, I think I sent this around, but 1909 there are 60,000 scouts in Britain. 1910 there are 107,000. 1913 152,000. And in 1917 194,000. Why was there such a short gap, not that much of a leap between 1913 and 1917? Because they're dead. They get killed in the war. I mean, they're going off to fight. Their scouting is finished rather early. You've got these big rallies, enormous in London, scouts coming from all over the empire. Girl Scouts are created in 1914, but Baden-Powell didn't care much about that. Now, there had been groups of frontier-inspired, youth organizations that existed in Scotland particularly. And they're called things like the Sons of Daniel Boone, the Woodcraft Indians, the Boys Brigade in Glasgow in 1883. Some were church-sponsored. Again, this is the sort of moralization of the working classes. You get them into groups. They won't smoke cigarettes, which is a good thing not to do. They won't drink. They won't hang out with the wrong people. They will go to work and become cogs in Britain's industrial empire. And they too can look at maps of Africa being increasingly painted red, which was the color of the empire. And so nature remains a part of this. Now. Again, to repeat, the cult of the American frontiersman, let me say a little bit more about that, is part of this, the idea of the frontiersman, the buckskin man. Rudyard Kipling, Rudyard Kipling is not my kind of poet, but anyway, he expresses often this idea, something hidden, go and find it. What's happening? I must have pushed something. I pushed something. It doesn't matter. Not easily alarmed. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges. Something behind the ranges. Lost and waiting for you. Go. Baden-Powell described the frontiersman whose manhood is strong and rich, of a pure life. Now, his own his own predilections is that for him a pure life would not involve silly women, quote unquote, as he put it. But the other idea is and this is not this is not at all. I'm not saying anything about his sexuality, but I mean the reality of the situation is that he preferred the company of young men to anywhere else, and this is involved in the way he lived his life. But the idea is that the freeman must earn independence with his gun. And this is, again, part of this old American Western idea, but you apply it to indigenous people. Now, you have aggressive models coming from the American West. William Wild Bill Cody from my wife's state of Nebraska had killed thousands of buffaloes. He had dueled. You know, a duel, I mean, these aren't, you know, the duels that they do with the German dueling fraternities. You've got the equivalent in Dodge City and all this, where you're dueling, and, you know, the classic kind of Clint Eastwood Western. He'd killed thousands of buffalo, dueled, and he's a killer and scalper of Indians. He was his own publicist, and he had enormous influence in Britain. After the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, he kills Indian chief Yellow Hand. In 1887, he crosses the Atlantic. He goes to London, Paris, and Berlin. Queen Victoria came out of her extended period of decades of mourning for her dear husband Albert to attend the Wild Bill Cody show. She wants to go, and she's there with all the others. She hadn't been to an event like that in 26 years. And so the irony is that Wild Bill Cody, when he runs these fake combats between the Indians and the cowboys, in stadiums, or the equivalent of stadiums in Britain, one of the ironies of this about art and reality merging is that some of the people he brought across the Atlantic were Indians who had actually fought in the battle against him in the Dakotas, and he hires them as extras, and he takes them to Paris, to London, and to Berlin. And they are a big, huge success. It's the Wild West program. At the same time in Canada, those of you who are Canadian know about the mounted police and all that business. And the mounted police become a powerful, though somewhat tamer, more acceptable, more vanilla equivalent of that, of keeping order, in Saskatoon and all these places like that. I've actually been to Saskatoon. It's a pretty nice place. And so the idea of these mountain men, now the mountain men get uniforms. The mountain men are no longer sort of, taking pot shots at people in Kentucky on the frontier or scalping Indians in the Dakotas. They're wearing, sort of freelance scalpers. They're wearing the uniform of these countries, and they're big-time imperialists. And so that's really the point. Here's a verse. I can't remember where I got that. Our mission is to plant the right of British freedom here, restrain the lawless savages, and protect the pioneer. It rhymes. And 'tis a proud and daring trust to hold these vast domains, but with 300 mountain man. You've got to kind of make that rhyme a little bit. Mountain man, like pronounce it as if you were a mountain man. But anyway, that's a little harder to do if you have an Oxbridge accent, which I clearly don't. Also, this is part of the whole, I don't have time to do it, and I've spent a fair amount of time in Australia, but it's also part of the idea of being Australian, too, but anyway, but that's another thing. Kipling's Lost Legion is really just awful, but here we go. There's a legion that was never listed, that carries no colors or crest, but split in 1,000 detachments is breaking the road to the rest. I'm supposed to be more respectful when I do this, but anyway. Our fathers, they left us their blessing. They taught us and groomed us and crammed, but we've shaken the clubs and the messes to go and find out and be damned, dear boys, to go and shot and be damned, dear boys. Virility, adventurousness, loyalty to boys, loyalty to young men, and brotherhood. And so it starts like that. Can I barely go on? Out from the woods of the great Northwest, under the austral sky, from the south and the north, they'll come forth at the sound of the mother's cry. At each at his post where the danger is most will stand as a sentry then, Britishers all to stand or to fall, the empire's frontiers men. Now, Baden-Powell is his own best publicist, even better than Wild Bill Cody had been. He helps plant newspaper articles about him. Here's one from 1900. It has been suggested that Major General Baden-Powell's unrivaled skill as a cavalry scout forms a quite remarkable inheritance of heredity, that he is descended from Pocahontas, the American Indian princess, which he was clearly not. But how does he become so popular? And how do these poems, these god-awful poems that I've just read, how do they become popular? They become popular because they become the stuff of boys' literature, of the culture of imperialism. They were the British equivalents of boys' life. I don't even know, I'm not knocking boys' life. I don't know if that existed. I strongly preferred Sports Illustrated and the sporting news to that. So they become the stuff that people are reading as they're looking at these maps of Africa gradually becoming painted British. Now, how did he become well known? Well, because he's an imperialist and he's fighting. In 1896, he fought in the Matabele War, which I sent around, not the war, but the name, a skirmish against about 1,000 indigenous fighters. And it's at that point where he starts coming up with his own freelance uniform that would become that of the Boy Scouts. And in military units, people that were scouts, again, the idea of tracking, you're seeing where the Indians have been. The Indians can see where you've been. Now you learn how they do it. You know, how the blades of grass turn and all of that. I couldn't scout anything, but that you see how they do it, and they become known as scouts, which is sort of an Americanization of a term. And this is what he likes to do. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, you know, there's a good example of that. I mean, I talk about the kind of narcissism of the colonial imagination and the imperial imagination. Rough, we're the stuff, we want to fight and we can't get enough. Whoopee. That's the song of the Rough Riders from the Cuban-American War of Teddy Roosevelt. So as part of the hysteria of the U.S.-Spanish War, but again, it's the frontier spirit. Now, Baden-Powell helps create his own myth. What I've said, he drew pictures of the people that he had allegedly shot. These pictures end up being in the tabloid newspapers. And again, the role of the tabloids in spreading all this stuff is terribly important. I said before, there are 21 daily newspapers in Paris at the time, and I don't remember how many there are in Britain, but there are an awful lot of them. He sketched a last stand of 8 people, supposedly, until they get rescued against indigenous people. He claimed that the Zulus, against whom the British war, the Zulus, Z-U-L-U-S, called him, quote, this sounds unlikely, the man, he who likes to lie down to shoot. And that the Ashanti called him in awe, this was his term for himself, he of the big hat. And that in this war in 1896, that they called him the wolf in awe again, his opponents. The beast that does not sleep, but sneaks around at night. And so he became the wolf who never sleeps. There's a slight problem with this invention of a term to describe himself as the wolf who sneaks around, is there aren't any wolves in Africa. There are not any wolves at all. So he made it up and made it up rather badly, having taken it out of some book somewhere else. But that doesn't stop the tabloids from referring to him as the wolf who never sleeps. And then, though some of the Boers understand that, and the Boer War, that is the Dutch Afrikaner opposition opponents, who, by the way, the British created the term concentration camp. And again, I'm not looking back from history, but they're separating men and women, children and women from the men, and trying to avoid that they receive provisioning out in the bush. And they create the term concentration camp in the Boer War. Well, the Boers, actually lived there, and had for a long time, though they're not an indigenous people. They know that there aren't any wolves there, and so they start mocking Baden-Powell. But he of the big hat did not slow down at all. And so in 1899, he has the good luck to be at the siege of Mafeking, M-A-F-E-K-I-N-G, where they are surrounded by a force, but not a terribly aggressive force. And again, he draws pictures of people on duty and all of that, night duty, and the town had resisted 217 days, stationed on the railway line that runs between the Cape and Rhodesia. This was a big takeoff for his reputation. And just the name Baden-Powell, the initials Baden-Powell, BP, become identified with British imperialism. BP, he loves the night, and after his return from the hollows of the veldt, where he has kept so many anxious vigils, he lies awake hour after hour upon his camp mattress in the veranda, tracing out in his mind the various means and agencies by which he can forestall the Boer move, which, unknown to them, he has personally already watched. He is the wolf who never sleeps. Now, BP also becomes, those initials, British pluck. The idea that the British are mudders. This is kind of the image that would come out of the very heroic, Battle of Britain and under the bombs of German Luftwaffe in World War II. British pluck, also BP, British peerage, British peers, the upper classes, the titled British peers. And so he becomes identified with all of this, the wolf who never sleeps. His advice to his own garrison is to sit tight and shoot straight. All is well here, he writes. I mean, they're able to get messages out to the newspapers who are covering this. Now, again, the British newspapers covered another siege, which ends rather badly, which is at Khartoum with the death of Charles Chinese Gordon, as he was called Chinese Gordon because he slaughtered the Chinese. And he gets his at Khartoum. And of course, school children, there's an enormous outpouring of tears over the death of this man. And the newspapers, because of these modern techniques, they can follow all of this stuff, pretty much how the siege is going, et cetera, et cetera. And so BP, the Prince of Good Fellows, Prince of Scouts, here we go. They emphasize his youth. He's 43, but he's youthful, he's cheerful. He's always whistling and telling stories even when things are going bad. He loves pranks, childish pranks. This is from some of the newspapers. Life was a game, but you have to play it honorably. And it was a game that silly women, as he called them, could not play. And he becomes known, again, sports, mass sports is starting just at this time. The Olympics are starting just at this time. Again, there's a reassertion of virility, in these Olympics. He's called the gallant goalkeeper, the gardien de but, the goaltender of Muff King. So a sports analogy becomes part again of this imperial thrust. They print patriotic letters to him, which can be signed and can be sent. You can send a postcard. You can send a postcard home. Your parents have left after Parents' Weekend. If they came, you can send them the following postcard. Dear parents, dear mom and dad, we have shouted Rule Britannia. We have sung God Save the Queen. We have toasted gallant Baden a half a score. We have sent our best respects to plucky Muffed King, and we have hoisted flags and bunting in galore. With a wild and frenzied madness, born of joy, the empire cheers, while we Britishers rejoice through the land. In this hour of jubilation, I am sending you a line with the wish that I could warmly shake your hand. Yours exultantly, and then you sign your own name to it. So scouting, as someone said, I can't remember which person, was an attempt to make these values, in quotes, entre guillemets, in quotes, of Muff King permanent, and to trace them on the map of these countries, of these peoples all over the world. 1909 newspaper said, it may be that he is not a great soldier of the sort which Napoleon or the Moltkes or the Kitcheners are made. He is the frontiersman, the born leaders of irregulars, a maverick, and the empire has need of such. Furthermore, he has the knack of seizing the imagination of boys and a deep sympathy with them. He is doing his day's work for the empire by training a number of manly little fellows to keep their wits about them and their eyes skinned. We shall profit another day in a much greater affair than Muff King. And that, of course, is preparing for the war against those other peoples who might contest British domination, not the indigenous peoples, but the other powers in Africa. And so be prepared, BP, the same thing, the same initials. Be prepared. Isn't that a scout? Anyone here a scout? I had to memorize this stuff. I didn't get a single badge, but a scout, be prepared. You're supposed to do that. The jamborees, he creates these jamborees. Also at the same time, I don't have time to talk about this, but this is the same time with Arthur Conan Doyle. And, you know, the idea of sleuthing, but it was sort of an urban sleuthing for evildoers in London. And sort of kind of merges with all of that. And of boys who risked their life, he says, I said to one of these boys on one occasion when he came through a rather heavy fire, you will get hit one of these days riding about like that when shells are flying. And he replied, sir, I pedal so quickly, they'll never catch me. Those boys don't seem to mind the bullets one bit. And of course, millions of them would catch bullets that ultimately they minded. I will do my best to God and the King. I will do my best to help others, whatever it costs me. I know the Scout law, and I will obey it. Again, I am not knocking doing good things for people. Please do understand. But I'm just trying to place the origins of whatever you think of the Boy Scouts in the context of the imperialism in the culture of imperialism, because that's where it belongs, and that's where it started. In 1912, in August, a boat capsized off the coast of Devon, I think. And 9 boys from 11 to 14 drowned. They were scouts. And there was an enormous national funeral service in London, in which millions of people saw at least parts of it. This helped their death, and many more deaths would follow, helped tie together the idea of scouting with service to the nation. A magazine called The Captain, again, this is part of the culture of imperialism and of aggressive nationalism, had a troop of mobile scouts on bikes fitted with a rifle bucket and a clip to carry a carbine, a rifle. And so it shifts. The image of all of this shifts from Africa, where much of the fighting was already over and indigenous people destroyed or pacified, to the European enemies against whom the next war would be fought. There's a famous cartoon in the British magazine Punch which showed a Boy Scout, complete in uniform, being prepared, taking Mrs. Britannia, that is the image of Victoria, who is dead, but the female image of the empire, by the arm, and says, "Fear not, Grandma, no danger can befall you. After all, remember, I am with you now." Boy Scouts played an enormous role in 1914 and in the subsequent years. Goodbye, I am off to war. There was a cartoon or a caricature in the newspaper as Boy Scouts joined up along with lots of other people who weren't Scouts in the war, and as you well know, they don't come back, or a lot of them don't come back. It's part of the mood of nationalism and of imperialism, of the new imperialism, and those two things are tied together. And the expectation, and indeed in many cases, in the case of Baden-Powell, joyous expectation that you could test your virility in a more meaningful combat than simply slaughtering indigenous people or picking off Boers with greater numerical superiority. By the way, Robert Baden-Powell, died in Kenya in 1941, from which he had just sent his last patriotic message to the Boy Scouts in what was a very different war. Thank you. I'll see you on Wednesday.